Okay, hi and welcome back. My name is Juha Haavisto and today I will be discussing historical eras. That is, the different distinct historical periods. So here's a question. Can you tell me when the Middle Ages ended? Or what were the central features of early modern? Have you ever wondered why history is divided into specific periods? And why do historians still hold on to these specific classifications? The main purpose for these categories is that they distinguish one from another, obviously. They draw lines on the entity, that is the past, to make some sense about it. Historians identify themselves professionally partly via these categories. And it is efficient. I call myself an intellectual historian who specializes on early modern Britain. And if I introduce myself in that way, my colleagues would have a pretty good idea of what I do. For others, non-historians maybe, I may have to explain my profession in a different way. For example, I try to understand different ideologies, intellectual frameworks, ideas and thoughts, and try to explain them via the context that circulated in Britain from the 16th century to 18th century. But this goes beyond self-identification. Universities, university faculties, publication houses, and conferences are usually organized around some sort of classification. Today, my focus is to present my views of historical eras. Okay, let's begin this with a disclaimer. A basic human instinct is to classify things into different categories. After the classification is done, we can begin a fight over the cases that do not fit into these categories. But we leave the categories themselves untouched. Okay, I might be provoking here a bit. I might be providing a one-sided view here. I think the basic idea of categories is helpful, obviously. If I say that I am an early modernist, people, historians at least, can draw conclusions of my work. My work is dealing with the things that happened roughly in the time period between 1500 and 1800. My work may involve aspects from earlier and later eras, but for me the bulk of the work is, for example, the late 17th century. Second, by creating these categories, we can produce certain models of specific eras. You just have to keep in mind that these categories are imposed onto different times in hindsight. The point is that these categories are established points of reference, and nobody should take them absolutely seriously. Every historian knows that the Middle Ages came after antiquity, before early modern era, but also that antiquity did not turn into Middle Ages overnight. Usually a year 476 is given, but there are always long stretches of transitional phases in which certain features of different eras overlap each other. So the disclaimer is, just keep in mind that this presentation is decidedly overly simplified. Okay, on with the eras. The first category is prehistory. That is the historical era that ended with the knowledge of writing. And everything before this point is prehistory. This is of course somewhat silly, because we can clearly have the historical knowledge from these times that we consider prehistorical. We just have to use different methods, such as archaeology. The second era is antiquity. This is a huge era, starting in Mesopotamia in 3000 BCE and ended in the fall of Western Rome in 476 in Common Era. It is immediately clear that as such, more than 3000 years, this era is way too big to be useful. There are the empires in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the city-states in Greece, and of course the Roman Empire. One point to make sense about antiquity is philosophy, and especially in the ancient Greece. The development of philosophy is one of the most important things of the whole antiquity. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus in effect created a basis for the Western philosophical tradition. But if we were to use that as the only example of antiquity, we would lose a lot of detail. Antiquity then is followed by the Middle Ages. roughly from 500 to 1400. Again, this is a 1,000-year period that includes communities that look very different in the late 5th century as they did in the 1400s. Rome itself might be the most powerful example here. The first centuries of Middle Ages are sometimes referred as the Dark Middle Ages, and this is usually a point taken to be about the life during these centuries. But originally, the term was used to describe the source situation of the era. After the fall of West Rome, there were very few written sources that could be used as evidence of the era. What we know of this era is based on written fragments, but mostly on archaeological sources. Partly the description of Dark Middle Ages is of course true. Life during these centuries was difficult and hard, but to be fair, this description can be used almost to any era before the 20th century. Horrific diseases such as Black Death was not unique to Middle Ages, and it did not go away until the end of 19th century. Antibiotics, for example, were discovered only in the 18th century, but before the mid-20th century, any bacterial infection was potentially deadly. To contrast this view of Dark Middle Ages, it has to be said that there was fair share of dynamism in the society. States started to form as regional monarchs gained political power, and the first European universities were established in Bologna in 1088 and in Paris in 1150. Similarly, there were major developments in commerce and communications within Europe as well between Europe, Middle East and China. Part of the growing development in Europe was due to learning new and forgotten things from Islamic world and China. As a result, the difference between Middle Ages and the Renaissance is not so clear-cut or dramatic as it usually is taken to be. Yes, there was a revival of ancient knowledge in Europe that was made possible by the Arab learned. Similarly, the European polities benefited from knowledge accumulated in China. So what sets apart Middle Ages and the Renaissance as eras? The answer relates to a continuous development that took place during the 14th century. The Renaissance began in Florence in the 1400s, and it is about culture, literature, art, commerce, and political theory. The Renaissance was ultimately about rediscovering the ancient masters and reviving their works. Such was the case with Epicurus, why the works of Lucretius, the Italian city-states, had for a long time, through commerce and financial services, reached a status by which they were also able to patron artists that later have entered the art canon as invented something completely new. There is a difference, however, between, for example, Ravenna in the 5th and 6th centuries and Florence in the 14th century. At the same time, it is true that there are significant changes that were not discovered before. To continue with the example of Florence, I point to Machiavelli and his infamous works The Prince, written in 1513 and published in 1523, that in effect revolutionized political theory, paving way to many others who either embraced his views or saw them as dangerous. The difference between Renaissance and early modern is even muddier. At this point, the eras usually do become defined with much more detail. For this video, I simply use a working number from 16th century to end of 18th century. I think that from the 16th century onwards, there is a process that is a combination of culture, commerce, competition, warfare, and it takes a hold of the world and starts to create a path of dependencies that will have an effect on the future centuries. However, these causalities are difficult to prove, and it does create a significant problem for historians. Early modern is for some historians nearly a curse word, but I do not agree with these negative statements. I think early modern is problematic, but dropping the early and just using modern does not really offer a better solution. So this leaves us with modern, starting from 1789 and postmodern replacing it from 1950s onwards. And finally there is the contemporary history, which in essence means the very near past, the history of our own times. Modern is usually defined by a growing interconnectedness of different areas around the globe, and by the rise of industrialization in production. Electricity and later oil helped human beings to create new ways of production to lift themselves from the restrictions of natural. This created all sorts of consequences, such as pollution and also social consequences, as the people decided to demand certain rights, such as the right to organize themselves into labor unions and expand their rights to vote. But in many cases, the old forces prevailed throughout the modern era, and the liberation was possible only after 1945. So raging on for about 150 years or so, the modern era features the emergence of reason over religion, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Industrial Revolution, the Communist Manifesto, and the first two World Wars. So modern is a very difficult to deal with in finding common features. A simpler way to date and to use modern is by centuries. So 19th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th century. But even then, historians run into trouble. The long 18th century, for example, spans from 1650 to 1830, depending on the different topics, and the long 19th century from 1780 to about 1990. So that is the end of First World War. All that is to say that there really is not a way to objectively define these eras. Historians use these terms and centuries to make their own life easier, but ultimately the categories are based on tradition created in the 19th and 20th centuries. They can be defended intellectually, and that is also the problem. Postmodern era is perhaps the most confusing and crucial eras, thus far at least. Usually the postmodern is taken to have started after the Second World War in 1945 and run all the way to our contemporary history. And people still argue that we are living in this postmodern society, which is completely fine. But as the era that is the closest to us, we tend to have an intuitive understanding of what it means. However, thinking in this manner is quite dangerous. Perhaps the greatest point that historians have figured out in the postmodern era is that all things should be exposed to different ways of investigation. For example, political events should be analyzed not as simple events, but beyond that, with as many different analytical tools as possible. In practice, that would mean looking into power structures of the political decision making, how the decisions affected different classes, minorities, and individuals within societies. Postmodern and postmodernism tends to break up the phenomenon under investigation into many independent pieces, and in doing so can provide foundationally different types of information than the previous historical research. This can be, and it has been, applied to all historical eras. To end this episode, I would like to point out one thing that has a serious consequence. My approach here today has been very Eurocentric, and I focus mainly on centuries of cultural, political, and economic hegemonies in different points of time. That is Greece, Italy, France, England, and the Netherlands. And the definitions and categories would be very different if we were to analyze this from the point of view of Russia, the Americas, or Finland, for example. It is also very obvious that these eras would be very different if we look them from the point of view of Islamic world, India, or China, for example. And with that note, we have reached the end of this episode. As always, I thank you for watching. If you like this video, you can follow the channel, you can smash that like button if you will, and you can write me a comment. Any of these three would be great. An extraordinary thing would be to watch the other videos I have made. Thank you for watching, and until the next time.